are. Not cut off. Do you want a piece that I'm cut off? The piece I cut off.
Wake up, give yourself a shake up. Get your body moving. Shall we try that? Yeah. Wake up, give yourself a shake up. Get your body moving. Jump up, bums up, give yourself a thumbs up.
Jump up, bums up, give yourself a thumbs up.
It's a beautiful day.
It's a beautiful day.
All together, okay? Ready?
Wake up, give yourself a shake up. Get your body moving. Jump up, bums up, give yourself a thumbs up. It's a beautiful day.
I think that deserves a round of applause. Stay on your feet if you can. The second exercise I'm going to do with you is one that I used in my group called Pause for Prosecco. We meet once a month to drink Prosecco and to discuss the big questions in life. We place our feet slightly apart. We take a deep breath in and out. So we're trying to centre ourselves down. But as we do so, we imagine the breath of God within us. And as we do so, we reach out because we recognise we're part of a community. So we're grounded. We breathe in the breath of God and we reach out because we're part of a community. So we just try that together. Lovely. So in our discussions over the next couple of hours, we're going to be thinking about what is trauma, the interaction between trauma and theology. And by theology, I mean God talk. And God talk can mean what we read in the Bible, how we talk about what's in the Bible, how we talk about doctrine, but it encompasses all the ways we talk about God. I know from my ministry as a priest that a lot of the talk about God happens not from what I say in a sermon. It happens in conversations in the congregation that they have. It happens in what they're doing as they move. It happens also in what is sung and what is not said as well. Also, the silence is part of our God talk. So that's how I would define theology. And just a bit of a background to me. I became interested in trauma and trauma theology a while ago whilst I was at theological college training, but also throughout my life and in my ministry I've had different trauma reactions to things that have happened. So I speak with some experience, but also in ministering or trying to sit alongside people who have experienced trauma in their lives and try and remain with them as they try and work out how to be.
There we are. Not cut off.
Your needles should be threaded. I didn't thread them all before because I thought it would take so long and you could be quicker. So your needles should be threaded. You have one bit of cut material that you've passed on to someone else.
Yeah.
And so you should have a piece that is fully intact and a piece that is cut. It is not a task in itself. Please don't feel it's something that you have to work on and achieve. It's something for you to do as we discuss, if you would like to. And you've got two pieces of material, one that has been cut and one that is plain, that's not been cut, and you might be sewing them together as you wish. So, as you have your pieces of material and one's been cut, you did not cut it. You did not cut the one that was given to you. Okay. So bear that image in mind as we think about trauma. So, we're going to have a think about what trauma is. So I think what's been named is the fact that trauma affects body and mind and spirit, that trauma often cannot be mended to how you were. There's a new beginning. That often people's lives are more fragmented as a result of being trauma survivors in how their body responds and their mind responds to that trauma. And that trauma can be a secondary trauma and not just the response to the event itself, but there's a feeling of overwhelm, that lack of agency. So I'd just like to show you three different definitions of trauma. So trauma is an exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. Directly experiencing the traumatic event or events, witnessing in person the event as it occurred to others, learning that a traumatic event occurred to a close family member or a close friend in cases of actual or threatened death of a family member or friend. The events must have been violent or accidental. Experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to aversive details of the traumatic events. For example, first responders to those who are collecting human remains, police officers repeatedly exposed to the details of child abuse. So that's one definition of trauma. Another definition: psychological trauma is an affliction of the powerless. At the moment of trauma, the victim is rendered helpless by overwhelming force. When force is that of nature, we speak of disasters. When force is that of other human beings, we speak of atrocities. Traumatic events overwhelm the ordinary systems of care that give people a sense of control, connection and meaning. Traumatic events are extraordinary, not because they occur rarely, but rather because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life. And then, finally, it's described as a rupture in body-mind, a rupture in time, a rupture in language and cognition. Those are just three definitions of trauma. Some of the effects of trauma can be seen in trauma survivors, and in trauma survivors there can often be an emotional numbing or a shutdown. There can be a sense that the story of the trauma event is difficult to tell. It can be fractured because of trauma memory, and it's difficult to communicate. But that's why I think it's good to name it as a rupture, because trauma affects bodily responses, the mind's responses, and often when a traumatic event occurs, the information rushes into the brain too fast and furiously for the brain to mark it. So it leaps over, if you like, the time stamper in the brain, and because it can't be processed and stored, the trauma event wanders and consistently replays itself. So if you like, flashbacks, PTSD, but that can also be a physical response. So a person can find themselves often reenacting the trauma event through their body. One of the more recent definitions of trauma includes secondary trauma. I think you were talking about the experience of knowing that a loved one is going through something that is difficult. Secondary trauma is defined as you have a sense of overwhelm, and the trauma that you're witnessing affects your own body and mind and ruptures it. And also communal trauma. To some extent, we could say that we've experienced a traumatic event in COVID, but the way we would respond to that event would be different according to who we are. And so the event couldn't be called trauma itself, because the trauma is how we as people respond to it. Trauma theology is a new discipline, really, of theology. It's been happening, well, I say new, it's been happening for about the past 20 years. And trauma theology is a reflection on suffering, but more than that. After the horrors of the Second World War, we know that Jürgen Moltmann offered a vision of God that did not allow suffering for our own good, and that suffering did not affect God. God was moved and changed by the suffering. If any of you have come across Jürgen Moltmann's Crucified God. But after 9/11 in the USA, that became a starting point for some of the foundational trauma theologians. And two of the main people who began to think about trauma theology were Shelley Rambo and Serene Jones. And they became interested in trauma as distinct from just suffering. And they began to explore the impact of trauma on Christian narrative, on scriptures and on doctrine. And rather than moulding them into trauma experiences, they took trauma as the lens through which to view. So trauma theologians always take the embodied experience of trauma seriously. They always take trauma as the lens which looks at how meaning is made in the scriptures and doctrines, theologies of our faith. And trauma theologians always say that there is a place of witness. Behold, the church has to be a place in which, as a listening community, the narrative of the trauma survivor is respected, even if they are in an ongoing state of trauma. So the body and bodily experience is foundational, because often trauma memory is embodied. So I'd like us to consider two aspects of trauma theology to start with, and that is the beholding, the seeing, the place of witness. And I want to share a bit about my my background and the visibility and invisibility of trauma, and the place of witnessing and the use of arts as a place of witnessing. So, when I was training to become a priest, I lived in a place called Birchfield in Birmingham, and it was in a parish of Holy Trinity. It was 2 miles from the city centre of Birmingham, and the whole parish was divided by a dual carriageway bridge, the flyover, and the church, Holy Trinity, was under the flyover. Not on the road, but just under the flyover. And there was terraced Victorian housing, tower blocks, and 1960s council properties. And there were local shops along the main Birchfield Road, and they provided the infrastructure for the area. And Aston Villa football ground was just outside the parish. At the time I was there, 36% of the population was under 15. Nationally, it's about 19%. And the population was characterised by high levels of unemployment, 3.1 times higher than average, and high death rates, deprivation. 50% of the population were of Asian ethnicities, 30% of black ethnicities, and the remainder white. So in the parish there was a mosque, Hindu temple, independent black majority churches, and the large Victorian Anglican church. On New Year's Eve, just outside the church, Charlene Ellis, who was 18, and Letitia Shakespeare, who was 17, were shot dead in a drive-by shooting. This was literally 100 paces from the church. And this produced a mass of national and local media attention, and the church tried to respond. Church members held a vigil, counselling sessions were offered, the church building was open for a book of condolences. But these events brought me many questions. I was training to be a priest at the time, but devastation, one emotion, grief, sense of being overwhelmed, for the loss of the young lives. I couldn't process my responses to the event verbally. It was too overwhelming. I began to produce artwork. And as I began to produce my artwork, it was very much an embodied artwork. I painted and painted with my body. I ended up painting a Celtic knot of my body. And I asked the institution where I was training, I'd like to put this in the chapel. Well, they said yes. I then produced a crucifix, and the crucifix was layered with bright purple and pink, saying enough is enough. And that hung in the middle of the chapel. And I then used music. One of the songs that was listened to in that community at the time was by a lady rapper who had been killed in a plane crash in her early 20s. She was called Alaya, and the song was called I Miss You. So I used quotations from the song and brought those into the chapel as a way of my processing. but also as a way of disrupting what I thought was the sanctuary of theological education that was not taking account of traumatised communities, the reality that they were facing. So popular culture became a framework for me for creating a dialogue of meaning between what was considered sacred and secular. There was a community event held in Aston Villa football stadium, and at that event the R&B star Miss Dynamite performed songs and a poem calling for an end to gun crime and stating, "Let no more of my sisters and my brothers die in vain." The family and the friends of Charlene and Letitia amazingly stood up to the podium in front of the whole stadium and shared poems and tributes to their children. And one of the themes in their tributes, even 20 years ago, was "I can't breathe no more." Other themes were "My life is like a jigsaw with pieces missing. I can't see the whole picture anymore." So it got me thinking at that time about the visibility and the invisibility of people who were trauma survivors in theological education, but also in churches who were trying to be part of and respond to traumatic events. And some of the things I noted were the following. In African Caribbean culture and theological practice, especially in funeral rites, there is a recognition of witnessing what is not able to be seen. So in African Caribbean Jamaican rites, when someone dies, the whole spaces of their homes are moved around in recognition that there are unseen spirits of the ancestors in that place. Also, in African Caribbean culture, there is something called the 9 nights. African Caribbean culture, there is an understanding that you sing to those who are even deceased, because you are engaging with the unseen spirit, the spirit of those who have gone before them. A community that isn't separated by a physical body. And often one of the songs that is sung repeatedly is "While shepherds watch their flocks by night." Also, in African Caribbean funeral liturgy, coffins are open. There's a respect for the visibility of death. So, just the culture of the people that I was surrounded by started me thinking, okay, as a white person, I and my cultural approach to trauma had made it more invisible. We've sanitised death in some ways. We have sanitised the body as well. So that's one thing that I beheld, if you like. The other side was there was an open microphone. An open microphone at a funeral, at the Aston Villa event, and so participation in speaking about the traumatic event was communal. There was a communal solidarity. It wasn't one person speaking on behalf of someone else. There was a communal participation, and the relational community became more important than hierarchy. So this again challenged me as to what beholding trauma meant. It meant giving voice to those voices that weren't being heard in order for the trauma to be seen and heard. And it challenged me because I think that sometimes the church projects more difficult feelings onto those outside it in order to deny its own anger. The church often projects difficult feelings onto those outside of it in order to keep trauma outside rather than engaging with it. And so that's part of the reason I wanted to take my art into my college, to say, hey, we need to talk about this, we need to see this, and to say withdrawal isn't an option, we have to engage. One of the key ideas from the early trauma theologians is beholding, is seeing. And the idea of seeing as a transformative point, a conversion point. Is often in the Bible we hear of seeing as a conversion point. And Serene Jones, one of the early trauma theologians, says this: I underwent a baptism sitting next to Leah, a lady who was suffering from trauma. A converted way of seeing. I had come to see that when one becomes aware of the extensive wounds that events of overwhelming violence can inflict on the souls, bodies and minds of people, one's understanding of what human beings are and what they can do changes dramatically. Such an experience shifts how one thinks about language and silence, how one understands memory and how memory works, how one assesses the instability of reason and the fragility of our own capacity to will and to act, how one grapples with fragmentation and disorder, and how one conceives of imagination. Seeing is a metaphor in the Gospels of understanding and knowledge, and often understanding comes from those who are not normally seen. Just a tiny example, if we think of Jesus taking the child, children at that time were often invisible, and he places the child at the centre. The child becomes the focal point, becomes the stand-in, in effect, for Jesus. And so with trauma and trauma theology, it's seeing and bringing that seen that is usually unseen to become more recognised. In Serene Jones's book, Trauma and Grace, she uses an example of seeing and relates it to the story of Cleopas and Cleopas's wife on the way to Emmaus. And she uses this to show that we can read the Bible through the lens of trauma. She argues that Cleopas and his wife were two disciples who were experiencing the traumatic effects within their bodies and in their minds of the events of the crucifixion. And she says, because they were replaying in their bodies and their minds the trauma, they couldn't recognise Jesus. And she uses the story of the walk to Emmaus as a challenge to abstract statements and says, look at the bodily experiences of these two people. The disciples could not see Jesus walking with them because they were caught up in a feedback loop of the violence. They were unable to see the gift of grace even when it was walking beside them. They were completely fragmented and undone by trauma. And that, she says, is like the blanks that happen with trauma. And she goes on to talk about Thomas. And Thomas asking Jesus to show him his wounds. And she says, even in this traumatic, if we look at this traumatic reading, we can see again embodied trauma that we have to take note of. I'll come back to that in a minute. Serene Jones also looks at the cross, and she says the cross is a place of seeing, of beholding. Even as Jesus undergoes horrible torture, dramatic death, he doesn't protect himself in a supernatural way. His body enters trauma. And she argues that Jesus is totally traumatised by the cross. And yet, Jesus doesn't stop loving. She says that he speaks out his trauma. My God, why have you forsaken me? And yet he refuses to turn around and curse those who have harmed him. That somehow he continues to look out from the cross at humanity and see goodness and possibility. And she says this is a definition of grace. On the cross, Jesus is consumed by violence, and yet he does not let it conquer love. And then another trauma theologian, Shelley Rambo, looks at seeing and beholding in a different way altogether. She says beholding is haunting. And she uses the word haunting to convey the experience of a life of a trauma survivor on the margins between the old and the new. She says that haunting is a word that challenges us because she relates it to Holy Saturday. And she argues that haunting is a good image for the Holy Spirit in that in-between time. On Holy Saturday, she says, we have an image not of resting, not of peace, but of an open wound. The remainders of trauma are in that space. And she thinks not only about Jesus, but the Holy Spirit in that space. And she says, in that middle space, what is there? It's the middle space between death and resurrection. It's a radical ending and a new beginning. And she says, between death and life, in that in-between, there is a testimony to the Spirit, a testimony to the love that survives and remains, but not as conquering. She says the love that survives and remains is not victorious in its remaining on that Holy Saturday. It is weary. And so she talks about the Holy Spirit being a middle spirit, a spirit that is a different kind of witness, a spirit that tracks the movement from death to life, even when that movement to life is difficult to see. And she argues that the church, as Christian witnesses, has to embrace that form of Holy Saturday, that in-between witnessing. The church has to be a people that remain with someone who is a trauma survivor and look for signs of resurrection without the overarching theme of victory, but with the theme of love bringing out the new by remaining love. She says, how can we speak about the unsayable in an intelligible and sayable way? And her way of speaking about what's happening in that in-between space for Jesus and that in-between space for those who are trauma survivors is a way of using the word remaining love and witnessing that can also be termed as haunting. Large concepts.
Do you want the piece that I cut off? The piece I cut off.
So we've talked about beholding as seeing, witnessing and remaining. We've also talked about trauma as being rupture of the body, mind, and some of the things that trauma theologians say that we should do is we should be rupturing our scriptures to see the trauma in our scriptures. So these are the questions that they tend to ask. So in the scriptures, how are the disorientations of time, body and word evidenced? What truths might emerge through those disorientations? And they ask, how could traumatic violence have informed the theology that you're seeing in that time, or have informed the symbolic constructions around theology at that time? So, when they've looked at those aspects, they then say, okay, so what has opened up in that rupture? What's opened up in that middle space? That we can then say, okay, let's think about God this way, let's think about doctrines this way. So those are some questions you might like to hold on to if you're wanting to try and think more deeply about scripture that you're reading in a trauma-informed way. So some of the doctrines that trauma theologians question are the following. You know, if someone is a trauma survivor and there's an idea of divine providence, what does that say about them and God? And then forgiveness and even confession. Forgive and you will be forgiven. There seems to be an imperative. You can only be forgiven if you forgive. But if you're a survivor of sexual abuse, no one can demand of you that you forgive. And yet it's often the rhetoric we use in church. And then hope. What does hope actually mean? Hope isn't a magic fix. And one of I think it's Serene Jones, she's got a really interesting chapter about how Rachel from the Old Testament speaks to Mary in the New Testament. How does the lament of Rachel interact with the Magnificat of Mary? You know, the hope of Mary with the lament of Rachel. And So if we are always, or we're often talking about hope, what do we mean by that? Because often in our epistles we also boast in our sufferings, because we know that the suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character. Really? How does that relate to a trauma survivor in a positive way? So these are some of the doctrines, if you like, that are questioned. It might be that you want to take those three ideas away with you and think, right, what have I been taught about divine providence? Does that sit well with someone who is a trauma survivor? Why not? And what can therefore be said instead? Or what does it mean in reality? Some of the trauma theologians talk about divine providence as relational, not God up there as king in control, but providence as what is provided in community. And some people talk about the spiritual act of hopelessness. Being hopeless is okay. And then forgiveness. What happens to the lament, the anger, if you move straight to forgiveness? And if you preach forgiveness, what happens? Often people will cover up, they can't forgive, and that then produces shame, or people leave. How do you enable that process rather than it being an act done to? There's lots of questions. But I want to shift us on to graffiti. One of the earliest modern graffiti writers was a man who is now known as Cornbread. He's known as Cornbread because he was in a USA penitentiary, and he wrote cornbread on the walls. And the reason he wrote cornbread on the walls because he was protesting about the amount of white bread they were given. But that name stuck. He used it as a tag name. What you need, okay, so you need to know two sets of terminology. A tag is a name that you use as a graffiti writer. And a throw-up is the style in which you write. So hold on to those. So his tag was cornbread because it was a protest. His name became a protest. Behold, see me, I'm asking for something different. Cornbread. And he is known as one of the early graffiti writers who was famous in New York, and a lot of people then copied his style. So what I'd like you to do is I'd just like you to think, okay, is my body protesting about something? Am I protesting about something? Or do I need a different name? In the Bible, at meeting points, often names are changed. Which is one of the reasons I think graffiti is great for trauma discourse. Because you come up with your own tag name. So I thought it'd be good, right? Have a think. What name would I have? What tag name would I have if I was a graffiti writer? Something about you, or what your body's protesting about, or what you are wanting to be resilient about, or just choose a name. My geographical area in lockdown in my parish, all art forms were on the rise.
Yes.
I had little houses being built in the woods. I had fairies hanging in the woods. I had graffiti in my church porch and in my churchyard. All forms of expression, I think, were on the rise. And what was particularly notable was the traffic signs that also had graffiti over them. And it was as if saying something verbally wasn't enough. The physical act of positioning a caption or a name onto something was important. And that, in the graffiti world, is what's called tagging or throw-ups. And I think they were signs at the time of protest, of wanting to be seen when we were all locked in, and of solidarity, trying to find someone else who thought the same thing as you. In London, some of the street artists painted nurses, and across the USA we had George Floyd images which appeared, and in Bristol we had graffiti over the Colson statue. So it became, if you like, a witnessing discourse to the trauma of that time, with a visual power to challenge and to advocate and to create a sense of solidarity. And if you like, it became a rhetoric of those who felt powerless. It gave them a sense of agency amongst the powerlessness. So I just want to show you a clip of some George Floyd graffiti.
Murals like the one we're at now, murals, street art, all of it that you're seeing right now is a response to say, yeah, this has all been here and now you have to listen. It's a visual way to make your voice heard that can't be ignored.
Our mission has always been to really look at street art and treat it as important, to treat it as valuable, and to, treat it seriously, I guess you might say. It takes a long time to produce something like this, right? And a lot of the stuff that you would have seen the morning after, the first night of uprising were tags that someone had to do really quickly, right? So because everything is really dynamic and changing and even dangerous, there was a lot more stuff that was violent, a lot of anti-police stuff, but it was more simple pieces, a lot of just slogans, a lot of just, particular kinds of tags. And now we're seeing pieces that are more complicated, that take more time to do, that take more planning, and that more people are working on. When I talk about the difference between the pieces that were early, that were really that fiery, violence, really resentful, like this is the pain that I'm feeling, this kind of stuff that's just really coming up from the gut, has changed over, not entirely, but partly, to more sort of collaborative pieces that are about community and about imagining the world that we want to see.
The one that we're right next to right now, it shows that vision of what they want, and they're referencing texts from the Quran that's talking about loving and giving to your community. It brings such a strong visual image to what justice looks like, and it's by a member of the BIPOC community, from this community.
What I see a lot in these pieces is a kind of visionary or an imagination of a world that people want to see. And what's really important about that is that we're seeing in public spaces, on walls, an imagination or a vision of the world that people of color want to see.
These feelings have been there. These aren't new events, these aren't new feelings, but it's a new response. It's saying that you can no longer ignore what's gone on.
You're seeing people of color's imagination happening out in public. There's a lot of art going up. We need to have spaces for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to put their art up as well. I think there's a lot of artists who sometimes feel like, even in a moment like this, that they're getting pushed out of spaces in favor of white artists. So I think that it's really important to preserve some of those spaces for artists of color. We're going to do interviews, so we're going to be looking to connect with the artists and people who live in the neighborhoods where this art is. We're going to be trying to figure out and hear from them, learn from them, what is the importance and the impact of this art in their lives.
As long as the art is changing, as long as this is a situation that's ongoing, it's a situation that we want to continue to document and to show the visuals and show what the dreams people have for the community and the reflections that they have and the emotions. It's all very important, so as long as it's there, I think it's something that we want to continue.
There is a way in which this art reflects the ideas of the community, the experiences of the community, the emotions, the things that they're going through. So I think maybe when researchers look back at this in some time, they'll be able to use this to sort of get a sense of, you know, what everyone was going through, how they were feeling, all those sorts of things. I think in some ways it'll be an accurate reflection of that.
Graffiti can be a visual rhetoric between the powerful and the powerless. Communities that are under siege have often looked to art as a witness and a testimony and a way of coping with the unimaginable. From drawings to poems to graffiti. In fact, every Remembrance Sunday I use some words of graffiti in the liturgy. Graffiti that was supposedly written in a cell in Cologne, where a number of Jews hid themselves for the entire duration of the Second World War. I believe in the sun even when it is not shining. I believe in love even when feeling it not. I believe in God even when he is silent. Art and atrocity seem to create a matrix for survival, to mark and to imagine a world in and through the traumatic violence. So, two people that have studied graffiti, Moreau and Alderman, suggest that graffiti is a way that individuals can challenge authority and contest existing policy in a way that helps them to exercise their own agency. And in doing so, it creates that movement of self-determination. And graffiti becomes defiance, but not denial. You just think about the images you've just seen. It's defiance. It's the people were talking about how at the beginning there was a lot of rage in the tags, and then it became an imagination of how they wanted the world to be. So there was defiance that didn't deny the lived reality of the trauma. In the 1990s in Argentina, the Sons and Daughters for Identity and Justice Against Oblivion and Silence painted graffiti-style murals to illustrate the truth that over 30,000 people had their unborn children removed from them because they were seen to be too socialist. In 2007, Banksy, the graffiti artist, invited a collective of 14 artists to work with the Palestinian people to graffiti the wall that was being built around Bethlehem, to make artwork that was available for sale, but those who wanted to buy the original would have to travel to Bethlehem to witness Israel's occupation and experience the checkpoints in person. So the wall became a billboard for people's political messages and images, but they also subverted the understanding of the dominant narrative, saying this is what we as Palestinian people are facing under occupation. And some of the images on the wall were a call to resistance, justice, freedom and solidarity. A plea for understanding the really embodied human experience of their lives. And one of the messages that ran all the way along the wall was, to exist is to resist. So we have graffiti as a witness to trauma. Graffiti both in the past and today. Graffiti as a way of resisting. Even in France, in the anti-Franco movement, there were tags of just the letter P. And today we have the tags of BLM, Black Lives Matter. So graffiti testifies, says, look, this is us, this is our experience, these are our injustices, and becomes part of the discourse. But one of the reasons that I like the idea of graffiti as a discourse for trauma is because often with graffiti, the words that are used or the images that are used are found in quite hidden places. They're found on underpasses or on the way somewhere. Even in the bid, I think, for Bradford, for the City of Culture for Bradford, one of the images used was a piece of graffiti that was found just as you pulled into Bradford Station by the train that said, "Hello sexy, welcome home." But graffiti is often found in places that are in between places. Yes. And why? Well, partly from this video, you could see why, because often the spaces that are owned by the dominant narrative are not spaces in which the people who are marginalised through trauma can speak. So these marginal spaces challenge power. And what's interesting, even in graffiti in the medieval church, was that there's lots of inscriptions in church porches. Not the church sanctuaries, but the church porches. And the symbols of graffiti in the church porches were often an offering against a particular threat. With the destruction of images of saints and of ritual, often common people who were facing the day-to-day realities of the harshness of medieval life still wanted that ritual. And so they used graffiti marks as a ritualistic practice. But where? In church porches. And these church porches were active places, especially for women, because they were especially places where women had ritual cleansing linked to childbirth, and that incoming back into the church. So the world was a place of danger, especially for women, both physically, and this was expressed particularly in graffiti marks, which were then often called witch marks. But these markings were made as a way to make their place a bit less hostile and in a defence of the soul. And if you look at some of the writing by medieval church historians who research medieval graffiti, you especially see that some churches in Norfolk have witch markings around the font. And it's argued that these were done by women who used the shears that they used to cut the corn to then go in and make the markings on the church fonts. So they were using graffiti to try and find meaning and protection in their life experiences of traumatic childbirth. But another reason that I think graffiti is good for trauma discourse is because graffiti is often fragmented. It's not necessarily a finished sentence. It's a word that symbolises the experience for that person. So it symbolises that inner conflict that's going on. And it requires the individual who is writing the graffiti to make choices, but those choices are often based on the emotions that they're feeling at the time. And these graffiti marks can appear and disappear. One of the complexities of graffiti writing is that they're often painted in liminal spaces, and the marks fade and disappear and then need to be rewritten. And often tags are buffed out by other people who want to write their tag. And so they're scrubbed off. And so there's that reclaiming of the space again and again. And for me, that represents the reclaiming of who am I in that disorientated experience of trauma. Also, sometimes trauma survivors experience problems with speech. How do you explain the trauma? Speech often shuts down. And so, for me, graffiti is a way of having that perhaps disconnected speech out there, still recognising the traumatic experiences. So I'd just like us to look briefly, if we can, at some other graffiti. I like graffiti tags. You can see them layered and layered and layered because they're messy. Sometimes life is messy. And so again, I just think, oh, look at that graffiti. People have been adding and naming things in the mess, and mess is okay. This is an image of George Floyd, and Capelli, who writes a lot about the George Floyd graffiti, says that the different images that were used around that time create different emotions for those who view it. So we've seen a bit of the graffiti that is anger and rage, but some of the other graffiti is provokes different emotions. So I wonder what emotions that provokes for you. She argues that this image promotes the emotions of pity and fear. Visually functions so that the person viewing it feels the loss. But she also argues, if you look at the top, breathing in our hearts forever. There's that fear, she says, of suffocating. Why does someone say breathing in our hearts forever? There's still that fear, she argues, in the black community, that suffocation. And she says it's an image that demands our attention because it's so huge. Can't ignore it. And then this. Let's have a look at that for a moment. This image is about the space it's in. So it's not just what's written or what's drawn, but by the space that it's in. Because this piece of graffiti was deliberately graffitied in a place that many black Americans did not live. You can see two white people walking past. And she says that for many black Americans, navigating white spaces is a shadow dance. And can see that in place that's been graffitied. The fact that George Floyd is half-framed recognises how much he was marginalised. And then this image is very interesting. Long live the rose that grew from the concrete when no one ever cared. And if you can see above it, someone's then written in agape in white. So this is a poem that was written by the rap artist Tupac, and it's a summary that he used for his life, because he grew up, he would say, in between the concrete being white America, where no one cared, and yet he still grew up as a rose. And then agape, again about community, love. So these words were reused in the graffiti that came about as a result of the protests on George Floyd's day. And then, so finally, I'd just like to say that graffiti is also a good place for trauma discourse, because it involves the body, and lots of graffiti artists argue that where the graffiti is written is part of the act. The body is recognised as part of the act. So the height of where someone writes the graffiti, the site of where someone chooses to go and graffiti, the physicality of the writing is all part of the graffiti. So the performance of the graffiti is recognised. So the initial marks of the graffiti can't be separated from the presence of someone who has written it. And so we talk about embodiment, and I think that graffiti also expresses that embodiment. Imagine climbing under a bridge, over a bridge, onto a train to write the graffiti. That reminds me, that perhaps to some extent graffiti could be that repetition of trauma. Why push your body to the harshest place to write? So just a few ideas.